None of us in here are firstborn sons, really, when you think about God's family. We're all lateborns. We all come into the story later on. But because of Jesus, we are granted that status as being the firstborn children. Because Israel might be God's firstborn son, but it's not his only child. And the Israelites are not his only children. This theme becomes so prominent as the biblical story continues. And our New Testament writers begin to make these connections. In fact, Jesus will use Exodus language to talk about his own life. He'll see his mission and what he's doing connected to this grand narrative. He would have grown up understanding the Exodus event. He took place in Passover celebrations, and he actually uses Passover as the occasion for his own sacrifice and his own death. Our New Testament writers begin to make these connections between the calling of Israel and the arrival of Jesus. In fact, one of the titles that Jesus has in the New Testament is he is called God's Son. He's God's Son. That's his identity that has always existed, that he's been there since the beginning. And so you see this connection that the writers begin to make. I mean, the Apostle Paul, he says it like this in Colossians 1:15. He says, the Son, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. What is Paul saying? He's saying that Jesus is God's Bekor. He's the one that the fulfillment of that story finds itself in. That as we look to Jesus, we see this great, incredible biblical story coming to this place of fulfillment in and through Jesus, who now becomes for us our Passover lamb. That through his death and his sacrifice, that's where the new Exodus, the second Exodus, takes place. And we are those who now get to step into freedom with God. See, it's only through Jesus that that takes place for us. It is only through the shedding of his blood that the price is paid. Jesus does ultimately what Israel is unable to do. And in him, through his faithfulness, through his obedience, through his perfect life and his sacrifice, we are brought into God's family. Pete Enns, who's a biblical writer and scholar, he says that we are God's sons and daughters only because Christ is God's son first. We're brought into that story. All of our lives in here represent lots of different stories, different journeys that we've been on. It's always interesting when you think about a local church because we've all come from different places. Some of us, maybe we were born and raised here in town, and so this has kind of always been what you've known. There's a lot of us, though, we've come from different places, and we've wound up here. And I think we all know that it's really good to be at a place, and sometimes it's good to be from a place, too, It's good to be from there. I'm glad I don't live there anymore. It's good to be from there. We find ourselves in this room. All sorts of stories, different experiences, different places that we might be at right now when it comes to our relationship with God and as we discern that together. Our stories collide and they connect in powerful ways. And all of us also have God's story, the story that God has given us of who he is and who his identity is. And maybe a simple way to think about it is we have God's story and our story. Those go together. Now, it might be that there are parts of your story that did not work out the way you wanted them to. It's probably true for a lot of us. Through challenges, through difficulties, through loss, through living life on this beautiful planet, but also on a planet where hardship happens and suffering happens. We all probably have moments of our story that haven't worked out, different things that define us, different events that have marked us and changed us and influenced us. But then what we also have is God's story. This intersection of the story of God. And what the Bible is, which is so interesting, is it's a collection of stories that come together, that tells one cohesive narrative of a God who's a creator, of a God who sees this world as something that's good, as a God who said, I gave everything for my creation, including my firstborn, one and only son. Whatever our background or our life experiences, the various vicissitudes that life can take, our story comes to a place where it can collide and connect with God's story. The great writer Henry Nouwen, he used to talk about how one of the things we do on the spiritual journey is we begin to see our story and we see it in light of God's story. You can begin to see all of the things that God talks about, how those events become to form us and inform us of our own story, and to see how those even will merge together. Because the truth is, whatever our life has been, whatever the journey that we've been on, whatever struggles have been there, God is declaring that he is the one who has purchased our redemption. And he's redeemed your story. He's a God who sees the details of that story that maybe we're embarrassed by, we hide, we don't want it to be a part of it. God says that he provides a way to join his. Because your story, ultimately, your life, it belongs to his. It belongs to him. None of us in here are firstborn sons, really, when you think about God's family. We're all lateborns. We all come into the story later on. But because of Jesus, we are granted that status as being the firstborn children. And that's something we celebrate. That's something that we build our lives upon. Because that means that what God has done in and through Jesus is not something we achieved on ourselves, on our own. Didn't come from our own might or will or accord. It came through his sacrifice and through the new life that is now available with God's Spirit living in us. You know, we mentioned earlier that this week is called Holy Week. That historically the church has set aside time to reflect upon the story of Jesus and his life and ultimately what Easter means. And I want to invite you to do something this week. I want to give you a takeaway. And the takeaway is really simple. I want you to think of God's story and our story. God's story and your story. And reflect on it. What are those moments that have defined you? What are those things that have taken place on your journey that have reminded you of God's love and presence? What things have been good? What things have been challenging? Or maybe even right now, honestly, what are the things that are obstacles? When you think about God, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? And do you see the way that God's story connects with yours? You know, a lot of times what we tend to do when we talk about our own lives is we think about, hey, where did my story start? And maybe we go to our parents and we think about that generation, or we think of our great-grandparents. Maybe you've done the Ancestry.com thing or 23andMe, and you're figuring out, like, what's my heritage? Where am I from? But I wonder if the biblical story actually begins to change that a bit. Where we start to see, no, my story, my biography is so much bigger than me or my family line. Because there was an event that took place 2,000 years ago on a hill called Calvary that changed the trajectory of my story forever. That the gospel message means that whatever my life has been, it now is redeemed in God's one story that we are all a part of. This week, let's take some time to reflect. As we celebrate Easter together, we celebrate the security that comes in our lives from the cross and the empty tomb. What the firstborn Son of God accomplished for us. Holy Week is the perfect time for us to think about our identity. Not only who we are, but whose we are. Because of the price that God has paid for us. You know, in the Bible, this is represented, this acknowledgement and understanding of this story, of the two stories represented and coming together. There's an image that we're given. There's an action that we're given in the Bible to describe this. We call it baptism. Baptism is the moment when we begin to say, yeah, my story, coming into God's story. Where I'm choosing to say, whatever my life has been, Jesus, I want to put my life into yours, to do what you did, to die, be buried, and to resurrect to something new. See, this Easter, we're going to celebrate the newness that God has for us. How those stories come together. How this incredible epic tale of Exodus points ahead to that second Exodus that takes place in and through Jesus. So this Holy Week, church, let's reflect, let's remember, let's think about our story and God's story, and open up your life to hear how God might be prompting you and inviting you into something new in this season, where he wants to take you right now in 2026. Spend some time reflecting on that, and then take that step, whatever that might be for you, to say, Jesus, yes, I want your life to be what my story is all about.